The warmest of greetings to you.
Who are you?
I am your storyteller, Chip. And you know, in 1916, Europe had been at war for 2 years already. And a man called Herbert Bower decided he was going to become a British soldier. Yes, he knew many thousands of men had died in that war already, some of whom had been Herbert's friends. But Herbert was also a father. He was worried about the German army coming too close to Britain. So he decided he was going to sign up in the British Army. Herbert's wife was about to give birth to her second baby. But for Herbert, that made it just all the more important that he went off to join the army and become a soldier. He wanted to protect his country. He wanted to fight alongside his friends. And he was a very good soldier. After his training, they made him a corporal, which meant that he was in charge of quite a few other soldiers. But that didn't make the war any less scary. Like a lot of the other soldiers, Herbert had to go and live in a hole, one of those really long tunnel-like holes that they had in the Great War that they called trenches. And every so often, the soldiers would be commanded to leave their trench and charge across a big open space known as no man's land. So called because no one owned that land right now, not while they were at war. Anybody who was in that land could get shot. But they would have to go out there. They would have to charge across that field and try and get to a German trench so that they could drop down into that trench and make it a British trench. That's how they thought the war would be won. Even so, while they were hiding in their trench, waiting for the time to go over the top, it wouldn't be quiet. They hardly got any peace. Shells shot across the sky every single day and landed with huge explosions that caused many of the men to have nightmares. And then came the scary day that Herbert had been waiting for. It was his turn to go over the top and lead his men with him. So, when that day came, he had his rifle, he had his soldiers beside him, many of whom were now his friends. And when the order was given, Herbert shouted, "Charge!" And the moment they were over the top of their trench and charging across the land, the machine guns began to fire. The enemy could see them now. They were sending bullets and shells in their direction, and Herbert saw in the corners of his eyes some of his men fall down. He couldn't stop. He couldn't stop to go and get them because that would just make him easier for the enemy to hit. He had to keep on charging. They had to get to the other side of no man's land. They had to drop down in that German trench to turn it into a British trench. He had to keep on going, and then BAM! A shell exploded right next to Herbert, and his world went dark. When he finally woke up, the air was so grey he couldn't quite tell if it was still nighttime or whether it was just a really foggy day. But what he very quickly realised was that his foot was in pain. Excruciating agony. The kind that meant Herbert couldn't stop himself from screaming and yelling and hoping that someone would come and find him and take him back. Every so often during the day, the Germans and the British would come out and they would find their wounded and they would bring them back. And he really needed the British soldiers to find him and take him back because he wasn't sure he would survive with his foot in such a state. But no one came, and eventually Herbert got so tired he drifted off to sleep again. He drifted in and out of sleep, and he had no idea how long he was in and out of sleep. But then, at last, he woke to the sound of soldiers stomping in the distance. Sounded quite quiet, and if you want, and if you can make a very quiet stomping sound. It was so quiet that Herbert couldn't really tell which direction it was coming from. But he had to hope that they were British footsteps. Because if they were British, then he would get picked up, he would get carried back to the British trenches, he would go to a hospital, and soon he would be back with his wife and children. But if they were German footsteps, then very soon he would be facing the end of a rifle. And that would be the end of his story. As Herbert lay there, the stomps got a little bit louder. If you can, make your stomps just a little bit louder. And now, Herbert could tell which direction they were coming from. But that didn't help him very much because he was so disoriented by the explosion, he didn't actually know which way was the British side and which way was the German side. So although he knew where the footsteps were coming from, he didn't know which side they were coming from. And, well, if they were coming from the British side, that would be great. He would be rescued, he would go back to hospital, and soon he would be with his wife and family. But if they were coming from the German side, well, very soon he would be looking down the end of a rifle. And that would be the end of Herbert's story. The footsteps got louder. They were definitely coming in Herbert's direction. And in fact, he could now just make out the outline of the soldiers in the distance, like their silhouettes. And it was just too dark for him to work out the colour of their uniform. If their uniform was green, that was great. That would mean that they were British soldiers. They would pick him up, they would carry him back to the trench, he would go to a hospital, and soon he would be back with his family. But if the colour of those uniforms was grey, well, that would mean they were German soldiers. And very soon he would be facing the end of a rifle. And that would be the end of his story. Now, the stomping was getting really loud. They were definitely coming right towards Herbert. And now Herbert could finally tell the colour of their uniform. It was grey. Herbert squeezed his eyes shut and desperately tried to keep quiet, hoping that these German soldiers wouldn't realize that he was alive, that they would just pass him by. They would think that he was dead and he wasn't worth their time. He had to hope that that was what would happen, because otherwise this would be the end of his story. He would never get to see his children again. And then Herbert felt arms underneath his legs, and he felt arms underneath his shoulders. And when he dared to open his eyes, he realized that the Germans were carrying him. These German soldiers were carrying him back to the German trench. It was too weird for Herbert to stay conscious for much longer. He wondered whether he might be dreaming, and he drifted in and out of sleep again. And eventually he discovered that he was in a German war hospital right at the back of their trenches. And after a while, he found himself looking up at the head of a German doctor who was saying to him, "It's no good. We are going to have to cut off your foot. Your foot is just too badly wounded. If it gets infected, you could die. The only way we can save your life is to chop off your foot." And Herbert began to cry. He really didn't want to lose his leg, but he also didn't want to die either. And in that moment, a voice came from somewhere nearby. It was a Russian voice. The Russians had been fighting with the Germans as well, so this was clearly another German prisoner. But this Russian said, "Excuse me, I am a doctor, and I think I can save his foot." But the German doctor said, "Well, it will be up to you if he dies then," and left Herbert in the hands of this Russian. But the Russian came over and introduced himself to Herbert, saying, "I am Dr. Figanov. I am a doctor from Russia, and I believe I can save your foot. We have all we need right here, and I am a good doctor. So rest. Let me save your foot." And 2 years later, Herbert was no longer in a German war hospital. He was in a German war prison. But he was still alive, and he had both his feet. He could stand on both his feet. And shortly after that, the Germans surrendered to Britain and its allies. And that meant that Herbert was finally able to go home and meet his wife, meet his second son for the first time, and keep in touch with Dr. Figanov. They became pen pals after that, so that both families could live happily for the rest of their lives. Now, I wonder if you think that story is true. It sounds a little bit familiar, doesn't it? If you've ever heard of a story called The Good Samaritan, you may be thinking of another story where someone is badly hurt and the last person you expect, the person who would come along and maybe make it even worse, they end up being the hero. So what, do you think that I took the story of the Good Samaritan and set it in the First World War? Would be very easy to do, wouldn't it? But I was very specific about the name of this person, wasn't I? It wasn't just Corporal Herbert, it was Corporal Herbert Bower. And the reason I know his name is because he went on to have another son with his wife after he returned home, and they called that son Len. And when Len grew up, he had a daughter called Jane, who just happens to be one of my good friends. So Jane told me the story of her grandfather's experience in the First World War. That story you've just heard is a true story. And to prove it, I've got some photos for you. This here is a photo of Jane's grandfather, Herbert, the character in the story. In fact, this here is a photo of Herbert with his family, his wife, and his 3 sons. That little one there in her arms, that is Len, my friend Jane's father. And in fact, here is a photo of my friend Jane with her father Len, Herbert's 3rd son, who would never have been born if it wasn't for those 2 German soldiers and that Russian doctor. And in fact, even more than that, I can even show you a photo of Dr. Figanov, the Russian doctor who was in that very same German prison and saved Herbert's foot. So there you go. That actually is a real story from World War I, even though it sounds like the kind of story that we might make up. I wonder then if you think that means there is still something we can learn from this story. Thank you so much for sharing that story with me. It's a really special story for me because, of course, it's a true story shared with me by my friend Jane. And if you'd like to hear more true wartime stories, I have one from the Second World War that I can share with you for your bonus story. To get it, all you need to do is have a go at my epic challenge. Look below to find out how to do that. Right now, though, it only remains for me to say cheerio, and I hope to hear your story soon. So, cheerio! And I hope to hear your story soon.